It is minus 30 degrees Celsius outside. Your fingers go numb in 4 minutes. Your lungs start to burn in 10. And yet, an entire civilization not only survived this, they thrived in it. No Gore-Tex, no heated floors, no weather app, just them. And the cold. And somehow, they won. The Norse people lived across Scandinavia, modern Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, roughly between 793 and 1066 AD. Winter up there is not a season. It is a sentence. In some regions, temperatures routinely dropped below minus 20, minus 30, sometimes minus 40 Celsius. Daylight, about 4 hours, if you were lucky. This wasn't a camping trip. This was just Tuesday. So how did they do it? Let's start with the house. Because the house is where everything begins. The Viking longhouse was not built for aesthetics. It was built for survival. These structures could be anywhere from 15 to 75 meters long, housing an entire extended family. And their animals. Yes, the livestock lived inside, which sounds awful until you realize a cow produces about as much heat as a small radiator. 100-kilogram animal radiating body heat 24 hours a day. Free. Renewable. Slightly smelly. The walls of a longhouse were typically made of turf, compressed layers of earth, grass, and roots. Turf is an extraordinary insulator. The earth itself doesn't conduct cold the way wood or stone does. On top of that, snow would pile on the roof, acting as a second insulation layer. Snow is roughly 90% air. Air is one of the best insulators in existence. The Vikings essentially lived inside a thermos. The central fire pit, called a hearth, burned almost continuously through winter. There was no chimney. The smoke went up through a hole in the roof. This means Vikings were constantly breathing low-grade smoke, essentially living inside a slow campfire. Archaeologists have found evidence of significant respiratory damage in Viking-age skeletons. Shocking. Truly shocking. But the smoke also served a purpose. It rose up into the rafters and preserved the meat hanging there. The ceiling was essentially their refrigerator and smoker combined. Efficiency through suffocation. Now let's talk about what they wore. Because Norse clothing was an engineering problem, not a fashion statement, the base layer was linen or wool worn directly against the skin. Over that, heavier wool. Norse wool was not the soft wool you know. It was thick, dense, and naturally water-resistant. Viking wool contained high levels of lanolin, a natural wax produced by sheep, which repels water. So their clothes were, in effect, naturally waterproofed by sheep grease, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. The outer layer was fur, bear, wolf, reindeer, seal, whatever they could get. Fur works by trapping air between the fibers. Again, air as insulation. The Vikings understood thermodynamics without knowing the word. Their boots were made from animal hide, often stuffed with dried grass or moss for extra insulation. Dried grass, stuffed into shoes, and it works better than you'd expect because, again, trapped air. They also wore something called leg wrappings, strips of wool wound tightly up the leg from ankle to knee. Similar to what soldiers used in World War I trenches, the Vikings got there about 800 years earlier. Now, the food. Because surviving cold isn't just about staying warm, it's about fuel. Your body burns significantly more calories in extreme cold just to maintain core temperature. The Vikings knew this instinctively. The Norse winter diet was brutally calorie-dense by design. Skyr, a thick fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, was a staple. High protein, high calorie, fermented to last. Dried and salted fish. Preserved meat. Hard flatbread that could survive months without rotting. They ate a lot of fat, deliberately. Rendered animal fat, added to almost everything. Fat is the highest calorie macronutrient available, 9 calories per gram, twice the calories of protein or carbohydrates. In a body fighting minus 30 temperatures, fat is not a lifestyle choice. It is biology keeping you alive. They also drank ale. Not for fun, well, not exclusively for fun, but because ale contains calories and water is often frozen. Ale in the Viking era was low alcohol, roughly 2%. It was closer to liquid bread than what you're imagining. They also drank mead, fermented honey water, which was higher calorie and higher alcohol, reserved for celebrations or very bad days. Now let's talk about the part most people don't consider: sleep. In winter, Vikings slept in shifts. The fire couldn't be left unattended. It going out meant everyone potentially dying. Someone had to stay up, watch the fire, feed it, all night, every night, for months. Sleep itself was also clustered, multiple people in the same bed. Body heat pooling under shared fur blankets. Privacy was not a Viking concept. Warmth was. The sleeping platforms were raised off the floor, important because cold air sinks and warm air rises. Even in their sleep, they were passively engineering around thermodynamics. Now, moving outside. Because Vikings didn't just hibernate, they had to go out and they had to move efficiently. In deep snow, walking burns up to 3 times more energy than walking on flat ground. Energy they couldn't spare, so they invented skis. Or, rather, they used them. Skiing is at least 5,000 years old in Scandinavia. Viking-era skis were made from wood, often birch or pine, and could be over 2 meters long. They even had a god of skiing, Uller, god of winter, hunting, and skiing. Skiers have a patron saint: respect. Skis let them move across snow at speed without burning catastrophic amounts of energy. Efficiency matters when every calorie counts. They also used sleds pulled by dogs or horses to transport supplies across frozen terrain. In winter, frozen rivers and fjords became roads, ice highways, faster and more reliable than muddy forest paths. They knew the ice, tested its thickness with a staff before crossing, knew when it was safe and when it wasn't. Falling through ice into frozen water was not a recoverable situation. They treated it with appropriate seriousness. Now let's talk about mental survival. Because the body can adapt. The mind is harder. Months of near-total darkness, short gray days, long black nights. The psychological pressure is almost unquantifiable. Modern research on populations at high latitudes shows dramatically elevated rates of depression and seasonal affective disorder. The Vikings had no clinical term for this. They just called it winter. And they built social structures to fight it. Story, music, craft, the long winter nights were filled with it, not from sentimentality, but from necessity. The Eddas, the great Norse mythological texts, were likely composed and memorized during exactly these long, dark winters. Occupying the mind during enforced stillness is not leisure. It is survival technology. The Vikings knew this. They also held midwinter feasts. Yule, the predecessor of Christmas, celebrated at the darkest point of winter. Yule lasted 12 days, the biggest feast of the year, held precisely when morale was at its lowest point. They sacrificed animals, ate well, drank heavily, made offerings to the gods. It was psychological warfare against despair. Now, the body itself. Human physiology actually does adapt to prolonged cold exposure, slowly, brutally, permanently. Cold adaptation causes peripheral vasoconstriction. Blood vessels near the skin narrow to reduce heat loss. At the same time, the body reroutes blood to core organs: heart, lungs, liver. The expendables get sacrificed. The expendables being your fingers, your toes, your nose. The body's triage system is merciless. Frostbite was common. The loss of fingers, toes, and ears was not unusual. Viking skeletons show evidence of it routinely. People who grew up in cold climates also develop a slightly higher basal metabolic rate. They burn more calories at rest to generate heat. Over generations, populations in extreme cold environments develop measurably different body fat distribution and vascular responses. The Vikings weren't superhuman. They were optimized by geography, by necessity, by the fact that the alternative was death. Let's talk about water. In -30, your water source is frozen. Every morning, every day, they melted snow, hauled ice from frozen rivers, kept water containers near the fire constantly. Dehydration in cold is a real and underestimated danger. Cold air is dry. You don't feel thirsty. You still need water. They also understood, probably through millennia of hard experience, that eating snow directly is dangerous. Eating snow drops your core temperature. You spend more energy warming it than you get from the hydration. Net loss. Now, fire. The hearth wasn't just warmth, it was everything. Cooking, light, morale, and quite literally the difference between alive and not. Starting fire in extreme cold without modern tools is genuinely difficult. The Vikings used fire steels, struck against flint. The tinder was prepared in advance. Dried moss, birch bark, which contains oils and catches extremely easily, and dried fungi. Carrying an ember from a neighbor's fire, sometimes for kilometers, was common. Letting the fire die was a serious failure. They also used something called amado, a spongy material harvested from bracket fungus to catch and hold sparks. In short, they had a complete fire-starting system, tested by experience across generations, that worked even in blizzard conditions. Let's talk about something almost no one mentions: the smell. A sealed longhouse in winter with 15 humans, 10 cattle, 8 sheep, a fire, and months of fermented food smells. Significant. And yet, interestingly, Vikings were among the most hygiene-conscious people in early medieval Europe. Archaeological digs routinely uncover Viking-era combs, tweezers, ear scoops, and even razors. English chroniclers at the time complained that Viking men bathed every Saturday, which gave them an unfair advantage with women. Every Saturday. These were people who lived in smoke-filled, animal-shared longhouses in the Arctic winter, and they still bathed weekly. They also used saunas. The Norse sauna tradition predates the Finnish stereotype by centuries. Heat, sweat, then, sometimes, plunging into snow or ice water, which is simultaneously insane and medically beneficial. The cold water shock causes a dramatic cardiovascular response. Heart rate spikes, blood pressure surges, hormones flood the body. Long-term, this kind of repeated cold exposure trains the cardiovascular system. The Vikings were accidentally doing what modern biohackers pay thousands for. Now, the children. Because surviving winter as an adult is one thing, keeping infants alive in these conditions is another problem entirely. Infant mortality in Viking-age Scandinavia was extremely high. Roughly 20 to 30% of children died before age 5. Winter was the peak killing season. Illness, cold, and food scarcity combined into something efficient and relentless. Mothers kept infants inside their own clothing, skin to skin, essentially incubating them with their own body heat for months. Modern medicine calls this kangaroo care. Vikings called it keeping your baby alive. Same thing. Let's talk about animals again. Because the relationship between Vikings and their livestock wasn't just economic. It was survival infrastructure. A single healthy cow produces between 500 and 1,000 watts of heat. That's equivalent to running several space heaters continuously. The animals were also fed and maintained through winter, because a dead cow produces 0 heat and 0 milk. Keeping animals alive through winter required huge amounts of stored fodder. The autumn harvest was partly about feeding the herd. If the fodder ran out before spring, you had a choice: let the animals die, or slaughter and eat them now. Both were catastrophic options for different reasons. It required planning with 0 margin for error, months in advance. The entire Viking agricultural year was oriented around winter. Everything they did from spring to autumn was preparation for the dark. Spring planting wasn't about spring, it was about having enough food come November. Every decision was downstream of winter. The ones who miscalculated, ran short on food, lost their fire, lost their livestock, didn't make it. Natural selection working at civilizational speed. The Viking culture that survived was the one that got winter right. What we call Viking resilience was not heroism. It was compulsory. You adapted, or you didn't continue. And yet, and this is the part that should unsettle you slightly, they seem to have found meaning in it. They didn't just survive cold, they built their cosmology around it. Winter wasn't something that happened to them, it was who they were. So, turf walls, animal heat, layered wool and fur, fat-dense food, communal sleep, preserved stores, stored fire, skis, saunas, songs. Not one of these things alone is enough. All of them together, running simultaneously for months. That's what survival looks like. We romanticize the Vikings for their raids and their ships. The more impressive thing, honestly, is that they made it through February. You complain when the heating breaks for a day. They had no heating. They were the heating. A civilization that looked at the darkest, coldest, most hostile season on Earth and said, fine, we'll live here. And they did, for centuries, which makes everything you've ever complained about weather-related feel slightly embarrassing.